comment that he doesn't feel very comfortable with the idea presented here, with the idea that there's a difference between colonial photography and post-independence photography. And he says that the African photography didn't start, the African photography made by African photographers didn't start after the independence, and that there was African photography since the 18th and the 19th century, since the late 1840 and 1840. And I will ask our to comment.
So, one of the problems for people who work on post-colonial studies, except Africa, Asia, Latin America, is sometimes scholars try to put a historical timing on when the colonized began to imagine themselves in the opposite direction, when they began to antagonize and resist colonization. So some people will say the post-colonial moment began after independence and so on. I don't agree. My view is that anybody, because it's a human impulse to refuse oppression, and the moment that oppression is very coherent, the opposition to it is also there. So in other words, from the moment a colonial policy was put in place and the colonial process began, from that moment opposition to it also began. The culture of Africa that was post-anti-colonial did not necessarily begin with the official date of independence. And I think what the scholar is referring to is assuming that Africans came to a state of consciousness at a particular historical moment. And I'm saying that opposition starts at the beginning of oppression. It doesn't start much later, and when a person comes into a state of consciousness that there is an unequal relationship between that person and another person. So that's why I'm point about it. So the other point about the response to it is, it assumed that the Africans who participated in photography during colonial times were also imitating. There was a mimicry of the colonizers. No, I think there were some who were, because the vocabulary of photography that was available for them at that time had a restricted voice, had a restricted style within which they could participate in the process. But those who were doing something differently, people like Seydou Keita, right? Seydou Keita's photographs were not overtly political statements, but if you look at them deeply, you will see that the subject of the photograph is deliberately posing rather than the picture being stolen or taken against his or her wish. The posing is what gives the subject agency, right? And that's where the political turning happens in the picture, where we see a relationship between the subject and the photographer. And so from Seydou Keita, Malik Sidibé, and all of the early portraits, even the ones that were done before independence, when Africans started posing deliberately, they were deliberately saying, I want you to see the way I want to be seen. And hence the title of our exhibition. You know, so my disagreement with the critics was that oppositional composition of photography began even during the colonial times. We just didn't see a lot of them, and their politics and style was limited by the conventions that was available for them. As German was saying, J.D. Ojekere worked in the colonial office. Seydou Keita was a policeman, right, who was taking mugshots of people in the police station. Right? So it is when people started turning this around, I think it began at the very moment where the coherence of colonial domination started. And I know the critic also, some of the names that the critic wished in the exhibition, well, actually Andrew is here at the back there. And again, you can't have everybody in an exhibition. It's highly selective. And as I was saying earlier on, the availability of photographs is also a crucial issue. We would have loved to have as many people in the exhibition, but that would be a carnival. But just to the point that you raised about what happened when the Africans participated, yes, there were Africans who participated in colonial paradigms of representation. There were Africans who did the opposite, and I'm more interested in the opposite. And there were European photographers too, who refused to take the photographs the way the colonial photographers were taking them. And they found kindred spirits, and they shared their skills and so on with a lot of those Africans. I mean, Seydou Keita tells the story of a Frenchman who confronted him in the police station. Why do you take a photograph of the Malians in the identity card format? Why can't you take their photos differently? And so he started thinking about it and so on. So it's a more complex situation where opposition to a particular way of representation, in my opinion, begins at the very moment when a person understands that the image is oppressive to them. They begin to imagine, fantasize it, and it begins to influence the way they handle the equipment when they have the opportunity.
Thank you. I think it's very